He didn't yell, he didn't argue. He simply stood up, grabbed his briefcase Moores, and walked off the plane. But what nobody on that flight knew, not the security guards, not the airline staff, not even the passengers who silently watched it happen, was that this man, this quiet, composed black man, held the financial strings to pull $4 billion from the very company that had just humiliated him. And that's exactly what he did. This isn't a story about revenge. It's a story about power, about dignity, and what happens when someone who's always underestimated finally decides not to speak louder but to move smarter. Let me take you back to where it began. It was a regular Monday morning at JFK International Airport, the usual chaos, people rushing, kids crying, intercoms buzzing. Among the crowd was him, a sharply dressed man in his 40s, black, tall, confident, the kind of presence that turns heads, not because he demands it, but because he doesn't need to. He moved through security with ease. TSA barely glanced at him. He wasn't new to this. Dozens of flights a year. Boardrooms, summits, negotiations. This was routine. Except today wasn't going to be routine. He boarded the plane early. Business class. Window seat. 2A. He opened his laptop, took out a few documents. Nothing loud. No calls. No disruption. Just a man getting ready for another day of meetings. Then came the first glance, from a woman across the aisle. Then a murmur. Then a whisper to the flight attendant. What was said we'll never know for sure. But moments later, a uniformed crew member approached his seat. Her smile was tight, her voice overly polite. "Sir, we've received a complaint. Some of the passengers are feeling uncomfortable." He looked up, confused. "Uncomfortable with what?" he asked calmly. She paused. "I'm not sure, but I'm going to have to ask you to deplane while we sort this out." No explanation, no logic, just leave. He looked around. No one spoke up. No one questioned it. Businessmen buried their heads in phones. The woman who complained? She looked away, so he closed his laptop, picked up his briefcase, and walked off. Security met him at the jet bridge. 2 guards. One stood too close. The other placed a hand on his back as if he were a threat. They didn't say much. Didn't need to. The message was clear. You don't belong here. At the gate, he stood still for a moment. No scene, no yelling. Just silence. A deep, heavy silence. He checked his watch. Then, with the same calm that had carried him off the plane, he pulled out his phone and made a single call. One call. That's all it took. Because the man who had just been kicked off that plane wasn't just a passenger. He was the chief investment officer of one of the most powerful private equity firms in the country, a firm that managed tens of billions in diversified assets, and a significant portion of those assets were invested in that very airline. They didn't see that part when they looked at him. They didn't ask who he was. They didn't care. But now they were about to find out. In the 48 hours that followed, quiet conversations started happening in financial circles. An inquiry here, a request to transfer funds there, then another, and another. Within 3 days, over $4 billion had been strategically withdrawn from the airline's investment pool. No press release, no drama, just silence and consequences. The board was blindsided. The airline's stock began to dip. Questions were raised. Panic set in. But he didn't say a word. Not to the media, not on social media, not even to his peers. He just let the silence do the work, because that's what power really looks like. They say when you're black, especially a black man in America, you're expected to act a certain way when you're disrespected. You're expected to get angry, to shout, to protest, to prove your worth. But what they never see coming is when you do none of that. When instead you walk away, head high, spine straight, and let your actions speak in numbers, billions to be exact. Inside the airline's boardroom, the panic was palpable. The numbers didn't lie. Over $4 billion had been quietly pulled in under 3 days, and the market noticed. Investors were nervous, stocks were dipping, analysts were asking questions the executives couldn't answer. How did this happen? Who pulled out? Why so suddenly? The answers? Sitting in their reports but buried under a bigger issue they refused to name. The problem wasn't just the money, it was the message. And worse, it was going public. Because while the man at the center of it all had said nothing, the silence surrounding him was starting to echo. It started with a single social media post, a blurry photo of the incident taken by a passenger who'd watched everything unfold. Captioned simply, "This man was removed from my flight today. He did nothing wrong, he said nothing, and somehow he scared them." The internet ran with it. People wanted answers, some wanted justice, most just wanted to know who he was. But he remained a mystery. No interviews, no press conferences, just a name, quietly passed around in financial circles like a whispered legend. And with every new article, every new tweet, every speculative podcast episode dissecting the story, his silence only grew louder. Meanwhile, inside the airline, things were unraveling. The CEO demanded a scapegoat. Middle managers threw each other under the bus. The flight crew involved was placed on leave. Consultants were hired. Policies rewritten. They issued a public statement filled with buzzwords: equity, inclusion, a commitment to change. But it rang hollow. Because people weren't looking for promises, they were looking at numbers, and $4 billion doesn't disappear without a reason. Behind closed doors, other companies took notice, not just because of the loss, but because of how it happened. This wasn't loud, it wasn't messy, it was precise, controlled, professional. And it came from someone they had clearly underestimated. A quiet shift happened in corporate America after that. Boardrooms grew slightly more aware. Executives reviewed their internal culture. Some even reached out to him, not to apologize, not directly, but to acknowledge that they had noticed. He didn't answer most of them. He didn't need to. In his own office, life went on. He sat at the same desk, answered the same emails, wore the same suits. But something had changed. Not in him. He'd always known his worth. But in how the world around him had to confront it. Because they couldn't ignore the numbers. They couldn't ignore the silence. And they could no longer ignore the presence of someone who had turned every assumption on its head, without ever raising his voice. There's a strange kind of peace in not having to prove anything anymore. He didn't do it to be a hero. He didn't do it to go viral. He did it because he could. Because that's the kind of power we rarely talk about. The kind that doesn't need a podium, doesn't need a microphone, doesn't need permission. So, what do you do when you're disrespected? When you're profiled, humiliated, dismissed? Do you fight? Do you shout? Do you demand to be seen? Maybe. But sometimes, the most revolutionary act is to stay silent, to walk away, and then pull $4 billion out from under them, just to remind the world who they just tried to forget.